Hello and welcome to That Horror Show with Lucifer Fulci. Tonight I will be reading a short story called Vanian and Satania. This short story is taken from the back of the book I have written called Azrath, the Unholy and Malevolent. Vanian and Satania. Satania's grind was deep and strong. She hammered up and down on Vanian's monstrous manhood, coupled with a healthy whine of something both gleefully painful and wildly pleasurable. Sweet and sticky moisture drained from inside her and glistened as it splashed on her thighs. Their ghostly white skin and deep black eyes were offset by the dry, brown, leaf-free trees that scattered themselves about a world far and away from anything an earthling would understand. With a wild grunt and a smile that reveals jagged, meaningful teeth, he turns his mate over and pulls her meaty, thick leg up over his shoulder and begins to enter her deeper, each time with a passionate squeal and a tear in her deep, dark eyes. Her breasts were round, bigger than her frame should allow. Her nipples were round and thick, such as the character of her entire body. They were a deep, midnight black and wildly succulent to Vanian. She was all that he ever dreamed of. To have her in his arms was all he ever wanted. His life, his entire being was complete with her by his side. The very sight of her would often bring him to wild arousal. Seldom it would be the times when he took her in his arms without moving forward to lovemaking. She gazed into his vast, dark orbs and moved him to her side, beckoning him to take her halfway from behind. Although the light of day was fading fast and all three moons were beginning to show themselves, sweat still glistened upon their bodies. Satania leaned her head back and breathed deeply. She felt closer to her mate than ever before. With each day that passed, she knew in her heart that it was the right choice to leave home and follow him into the wild. She would be willing to walk with him until her last day. She let him go and looked at him, smiling. She lowered her head to his stomach and then below. She took his massive girth in her mouth and began to moan. She took him just as far as she possibly could and then began to choke, just a bit at first until she forced it further down her throat. She gagged and drooled. He grunted, then putting his hand on her head, pushed her face down into her neck until her neck was full of his ghostly member. His black fingernails blended in with her midnight hair as he squeezed and pulled, breathing heavily the whole time. The night began to speak, each wild sound louder than the last. The Zernian slithered just beyond the shadows and crawled beneath the surface, winding down to the cold underworld. They curled back up together, taking in the coming night. I have never been happier, not ever in my life. Satania touched her mate's face and breathed in his dark soul. I am sorry that it took me so long to finally come to you. All that matters is this moment, now. Vanian sat up and leaned over to Satania. He kissed her softly upon her face. This time, nothing will keep our souls from one another. Their lives were so much more than the flesh. They were wild, darksome creatures of the spirit. They were forever. Their memories of past lives were as clear as the moments before them, and they understood that there was something far greater than what they had ever been before. With each and every life, they learned about the magic within them, the very sounds of the supernatural that were the musics of their eternity. I miss my father, Satania, the one man who taught me what it meant to be alive, what it means to be a man. I miss him each and every day. She took him in her arms. He will always be here, she said quietly, because he lives in you. He lives in your nobility and in your honor. He watches us even now. Vanian snickered. Well, I hope he wasn't watching all of that. His death was... Satania stopped. Vanian looked up and around. What is it? They both took notice of fires burning off in the distance. There was a tribe of skanglers. They were a tiny, thin, sickly breed of the undead, but in great numbers they could be dangerous, deadly. They would devour you whole. There was a human there, a man, trembling in the shadows of these demonic creatures. He was wrapped in some old gray cloth and shredded clothing underneath. Tears trailed down his aged face and dripped into a small pool of blood and sweat below. His eyes peeked up in a terrible fear and saw the living death before him. The Skanglers were humanoid, but so much less than a man could ever be, like deathly dwarves with thick white worms fleeing in and out of their rotted skin. They lusted for the flesh of this man, this meal, but still they remained at bay. The command of their witch queen was powerful, even as she remained hidden. "Stay here," Vanian commanded. "I need to see what I can do." Satania nodded and knelt down in the shadows and readied her weapon. She could easily blast the head off of one of the creatures from this distance. Up close, too, she could take down a group of Skanglers with a blade or a blunt object. Vanian, on the other hand, could dispatch a horde of them with his hands and not one wasted breath. Kissing one another for a brief moment, they looked into each other's eyes, swirling their black tongues and then releasing. Vanian moved downward to the scene below, quiet and sure. The scared man cowered before the undead. The creatures grunted and drooled, each one of them eager to sink their teeth into his warm skin. He looked around, weary and confused. It was then that her invisible voice, angered, cut into the night. "You fool! How dare you tell me tales of wizardry and wisdom when you are nothing but a mere mortal maggot?" The voice was wicked, possessed by a fury unlike anything he had ever known. It was a layered tone, like 2 or 3 voices on top of one another. The first, a violent woman scorned. Next, a deeper variation of the first, and the bottom voice, a demonic gurgle that echoed even after she stopped speaking. Piss began to drip down his leg. He cried to the hidden Skangler queen, "My infernal majesty, I beg for mercy. I did not know that my powers would not work on your planet. I am weak here, but have all power elsewhere. Allow my life to continue, and I shall wield my wizardry in your honor for all time." Silence filled the air. The Skanglers backed away from the human, and their queen began to reveal herself. A morbid hiss perked the ears of her followers, and the sound of her giant serpentine body moved over the ground about her. She slithered up and out of the moonlight, revealing herself. She was a Gorgoth, 3 times the size at least of her cowering prey. Her bottom half, entirely reptilian in the form of a snake, was black and gray interwoven. Upon her scaly skins were minions of white spider-like crawlers that gave off a quiet yet noticeable hiss and whine as they scurried about her lower half. Upward to her torso was gray to white, with massive breasts, swaying and bouncing to the fearful excitement of all that laid eyes upon her. Her nipples, midnight black, had living, breathing slits down the middle of each of them. The man looked at her with a strange fascination, regardless of his unknown fate. Her eyes were a brilliant green, all 6 of them. Her bald head was smooth, her toothless mouth smooth as well. She moved toward the human and slurped her oversized forked tongue and flicked it in the air. Her appendages were tentacles, with suction cups running up and down the length of them. She used them to push herself across the ground from time to time. She reached the man and curled her body up and around him. She smelled him and released a sticky yellow stream of fluid from her back end. The crawlers began to move away from their queen and scoot up upon the ground by the Skanglers that continued to remain in unison. She squeezed her body around him tighter, and her tentacles attached themselves to his body. At once, she knew his thoughts, his dreams, his fortune. She licked his face up and down and whispered to him, "Fuck me." The man swallowed what little saliva he had left in his throat. He began to roll into the back of his eyes began to roll into the back of his head as the Gorgoth twirled her tentacles down his front end and released his cock. "Say my name," she commanded. "Speak my name." He took a deep breath and screamed, "Natalian." In that moment, the creature shoved the man's penis inside the slot of her giant left breast. It closed in around his tender meat, sucking and pulling into a deeper place, somewhere warm, tight, and wet. The human resided in the momentary pleasure, but still fear and loathing beat in his heart. He pumped it in and out of her, all the while the creature surrounding him closer and closer, taking in the moments of lust. The human breathed heavily. The Skanglers grunted in unison. The moment was rising in fury. The Gorgoth was about to drain the man and feed him to her minions, and then it smelled something. "Vanian, you are here," it grunted. It felt happy inside, and then it snapped its teeth inside of the breast, and off came the man's meat. The thick and dirty cock was snipped in two, Ragnar spraying blood from both sides. The severed side fell quickly to the ground, and the stump remained sickening and jetting some putrid plasma. The man screamed a howling fury, wailing and crying all at once. He fell to his knees and then to the ground, shaking and quivering for the pain he was in. Vanian rose from the shrubbery he was shrouded in and revealed himself to the scene. "Witch!" he cried, and began to walk closer to the Gorgoth, aimed for the butchery of her giant body. She began to slither backwards and hiss at Vanian. The undead crowded the body of the wounded man, each one of them fighting for a taste, a simple suckle of the blood-spraying wound by his flailing genitals. They chewed madly at the stringy flesh around his crotch and drank wildly of his bleeding. Others that scurried in the shadows scooped up the castration and chewed on it until there was nothing left. Pieces of tattered skin slid past their rotted gums and down their throats. They attacked his flesh, each skangler sinking its rotted teeth deeply into the skins of the dying man. His weakened flesh ripped like warm candle wax, each inch further found, bleeding and bubbling while he gasped for his breath. Layers of fat and muscle fell away into the mouths of the bloodthirsty things. It was a gruesome sight, this hounding and feeding upon the flesh of this failed wizard. While some of them ran off into the strange alien night, a few of them remained upon the man. One in particular was sticking his jagged fingers into the fresh wound of his crotch, pulling and stretching it open wider and wider. It stuck its long forked tongue into the chasm of blood and gore, nibbling on the torn hunks of tissue that burned the flesh like a burning red fire poker. The small pieces of skin tore easily, while the fattier chunks of meat took a greater effort to bite into and pull away from the body. Life escaped him. Vanian smashed them as he came closer upon the Gorgoth, putting them to death with ease. He was upon the demon queen, and then he heard it. Cries in the night, a cry of fear from the hillside above. The Skanglers had found Satania, and were making off with her into the endlessness of the night. And that, my fiends, is the end of that particular story. You could look for more adventures of Vanian and Satania in future books and short stories of mine. If you want any information, you can go to www.luciferfulci.com.